She had hung it in the very center of the living room wall in the best frame she could find in my own cabinet. A wide mahogany frame I had saved for years, the kind with a beveled glass that catches the afternoon light. I stood in front of it for almost a full minute before I understood what I was looking at. There I was, in my memory, standing behind my son Marcus, one hand on his shoulder, my other arm around my granddaughter Lily. I had worn the cream-colored blouse. I remembered it clearly. And yet in the photograph on my wall, where I should have been, there was nothing but a strip of summer garden, blurred and green, as though I had never existed. My daughter-in-law Renata had cropped me out, printed the edited version, framed it, and hung it in my house. And when I turned to look at her, she shrugged with the kind of bored confidence that only comes from someone who has never once been told no and said, "Nobody will notice, Eleanor. Don't be so sensitive." She was wrong about both things. Everybody would notice. And I am the least sensitive woman I know. There is a lesson at the center of this story, and I want to say it plainly before I go any further. What a person allows to happen once will eventually be treated as what a person agrees to forever. I had spent years allowing small things, a canceled invitation here, an overlooked remark there, a favor that became a tax. And none of it seemed worth the discomfort of confronting it. But allowances accumulate. They settle into the floor of a relationship like sediment, hardening into something the other person starts to call a foundation. The day I stood in front of that photograph, I was not angry. I was finished. My name is Eleanor Voss. I am 64 years old, and I have been a widow for 3 years. My husband, Gerald, died quietly, the way he had lived. Without fuss, without drama, in his own bed on a Tuesday morning in October. He left me a paid-off house, a moderate savings account, a retirement fund that belongs entirely to me, and a very clear understanding of my own value that, for a time after his death, I had allowed grief to obscure. The day I saw that photograph, something in me settled back into place. Gerald would have said it was about time. If you have ever felt erased by a family member, by a person who lives in your home and treats your generosity as their right, I think you will recognize something in what I am about to tell you. And if you haven't, I hope you never do. But if you are watching this channel, you are probably here because you understand, at some level, what it feels like when love is used as leverage. Stay with me until the very end of this story. I think it will mean something to you, and if it does, I hope you will let me know in the comments, because your words have kept me company more times than I can count. I retired 3.5 years ago, about 6 months before Gerald passed. I had worked for 31 years as an office administrator for a regional hospital network. Not glamorous work, but steady, and it had taught me more about managing complicated people than any degree ever could. When I retired, I came home to a house that was mine, a garden that needed attention, and a calendar that was beautifully, almost shockingly empty. The first month, I will admit, felt strange. I had spent most of my adult life organized around other people's schedules. Suddenly, there was no schedule but my own. I learned to make proper tea instead of grabbing whatever the break room had. I read books during the day. I sat on my back porch and watched the light change over the garden without feeling guilty about it. These are small things, but for a woman who had given her time so freely and for so long, they felt enormous. They felt like something I had earned. My house is a 2-story colonial on a quiet street in a suburb I have lived in for 22 years. It is not a large house, but it is well maintained, because maintaining it has always been a point of pride for me. Gerald and I painted it together the summer after we paid off the mortgage. The garden was my project. Beds of lavender along the back fence, a small kitchen garden near the side gate, 2 old apple trees that bloom extravagantly every May and drop their fruit onto the lawn in August whether I'm ready or not. The house has 4 bedrooms. Mine, a sitting room I use as a small study, a guest room that I keep clean and neutral, and a 4th room that I had converted into a craft space after Lily was born and I started making her handmade quilts. It was on a morning in late July that everything tilted. I was in the kitchen, as I usually am around 9 in the morning, standing at the counter with a cup of tea and the crossword from the previous day's paper. The windows were open. The air was cool in the way that late July mornings sometimes manage before the heat reasserts itself by 10. It was one of those moments that felt, in retrospect, like a held breath. a moment of stillness that the world gives you just before it stops being still. My phone buzzed on the counter. It was Marcus. He asked if he and Renata and Lily could come stay for a few weeks while the contractors finished the renovation on their kitchen and one of their bathrooms. He said it would only be 2, maybe 3 weeks at the most. He said Lily had been asking for Grandma Eleanor. He said Renata had already been looking for a short-term rental, but they were all so expensive. He said it in that particular way Marcus has always had, stacking reasons like sandbags one on top of another, so that by the time he reaches the actual request, it is already half buried. I want to describe my relationship with my daughter-in-law carefully, because I am not interested in being unfair to her. Renata is not a villain in the operatic sense. She does not cackle. She does not scheme in dark corners. What she does is quieter and, in its way, more effective. She treats the world as though it has a standing obligation to accommodate her comfort, and she does it with such practiced ease that most people around her simply comply before they have finished deciding whether they meant to. I had watched her do this with Marcus for years. I had watched her do it with her own mother, with her friends, with wait staff, with anyone who crossed her path and offered even the smallest opening. The word I would use for it is assumption. Renata does not ask whether she is welcome. She assumes she is, and she arranges herself accordingly. And then she waits to see if anyone will push back. Very few people had ever pushed back. My relationship with her had always been civil. We exchanged pleasant words at holidays. We agreed about Lily's schooling. We complimented each other's cooking with the slightly mechanical warmth of two people performing a social function they both understand. She was polite to me when she needed to be, and vague when she didn't. I had accepted this dynamic because Marcus was happy and Lily was thriving, and because I had been taught, as most women of my generation were taught, that a peaceful family requires certain deliberate silences. I had been taught to value the calm above the honest conversation, even when the honest conversation was what was actually needed. That teaching had cost me more than I want to calculate. The pattern between us did not begin with the photograph. It began years earlier, in a series of small concessions so ordinary they barely registered at the time. The first real accommodation I can point to clearly happened about 8 months after Marcus and Renata were married. They had just moved into their apartment, and Renata had mentioned, in passing, that she loved the holiday entertaining set I had. The large serving platters, the set of crystal glasses Gerald had given me for our 25th anniversary, the hand-embroidered table linens I had kept in tissue paper for years. I had offered to loan them for a dinner they were hosting. One loan became a standing borrow. The crystal glasses lived in their apartment for almost 2 years before I asked for them back. And the way Renata received that request, with a brief flash of something behind her eyes, a tiny recalibration of her expression, told me that she had quietly reclassified my things as shared property without ever saying so out loud. There was the summer when Marcus lost his job, and I gave them 3 months of mortgage payments. I did not lend the money. I gave it because he was my son, and the situation was genuinely difficult, and because Gerald had always said that family is what you do when things are hard. I do not regret that. What I do mark is what happened after he found a new position. There was no formal acknowledgement, no conversation about the money, only a gradual return to normalcy that implied the gift had already been fully absorbed and was no longer relevant. And when the following Christmas came and I mentioned gently that I was watching my expenses, Renata said, without looking up from her phone, "Well, you've always managed." As though my managing were a resource she could count on rather than a habit I had built with my own discipline. There was Lily's 6th birthday, the one where I baked the cake from scratch. 4 layers, cream cheese frosting, hand decorated with the little sugar flowers Lily had chosen herself from a picture in a magazine. I arrived with the cake and found that Renata had ordered an elaborate bakery cake that was already on the table. She had forgotten to tell me. She shrugged it off with a light laugh and said the bakery cake was already paid for and we could put my cake in the kitchen for later. And later never really came. I drove home with 3 of the 4 layers still untouched. I fed 2 of them to my neighbor's dog. I'd been managing this particular kind of forgetting for years. Each time, I found a reasonable explanation for it. She is busy, she is young, she did not mean it the way it sounded, she did not think. And each time, I folded the moment into a growing collection of moments I had filed under the category of things I had decided not to make a problem. That collection had grown very large without my fully noticing. What changed, structurally, was Gerald's death. Not immediately. Grief does strange things to your priorities, and for the first year after he passed, I was mostly focused on getting through the days intact. But by the second year, something had clarified. I was entirely on my own for the first time in 39 years. My finances were stable. My house was paid for. My children, Marcus and my daughter Claire, who lives out of state and is not part of this particular story, were adults managing their own lives. I had, for the first time, no financial obligations that were not entirely my own choice to carry. And I realized, slowly and then all at once, that I had been operating under the assumption that being part of a family meant making yourself perpetually available as a resource. I had confused love with supply. So when Marcus called that July morning, I said yes. I said it because of Lily, and because 3 weeks is a finite thing, and because I am capable of generosity when the situation genuinely calls for it. They arrived on a Friday afternoon. Lily ran to me at the door the way only a 7-year-old can. Full speed, arms out, with a confidence that the person she is running to will absolutely catch her. I caught her. I always catch Lily. That part of the visit was perfect. The rest began its deterioration quietly, the way it always does with Renata. By Saturday, she had moved several of her personal items into the bathroom she was sharing with Marcus, spreading them across every surface with the thoroughness of someone who expects not to be inconvenienced. By Sunday, she had rearranged the kitchen in a way that made her cooking easier and my use of my own space slightly awkward. She had moved my kettle to the far end of the counter. She had reorganized the cabinet above the stove so that her preferred oils and spices were at the front. She did these things without mentioning them, which was, I understood by now, always how she did things. She rearranged, she assumed, she occupied. On Monday evening, she told me, not asked me, that she had invited 2 friends over for dinner that Wednesday. She said she would handle the cooking. I noted that she did not ask whether Wednesday was convenient for me. I noted that she said handle the cooking in a way that implied my kitchen was a neutral facility available for her use. I said I had a prior engagement Wednesday evening, which was not quite true, but felt important to say. She looked briefly surprised, then said, "Oh, well, I can still have them here, right? You can just, I don't know, do your thing when you get back." She was already moving toward the refrigerator. The conversation, as far as she was concerned, was over. On Tuesday morning, I found her on a phone call in my study. Not in the guest room, not at the dining table. In my study, sitting in the chair I keep by the window, among my books and Gerald's old drafting compass and the small photograph of my mother that I have kept on that particular windowsill for 7 years. She had closed the door. When I knocked and opened it, she held up one finger without turning around, signaling for me to wait. I did not wait. I closed the door again and went to the kitchen and stood with both hands flat on the counter and looked out the window at the garden for a long moment, and I thought, this is it, isn't it? This is the version of it I always knew was coming. That same afternoon, Marcus and Renata and Lily had gone out to a hardware store and a garden center. Something about plants they wanted to put on their own back deck when the renovation was finished. I was alone in the house, which I was grateful for. I walked through the rooms slowly, the way I do sometimes when I need to remember that the house belongs to me. I straightened a few things in the kitchen. I checked the mail. I came into the living room intending to open the windows and let the afternoon air through. That was when I saw it. The photograph. In the mahogany frame I had meant for Gerald's portrait. Hung on the wall above the console table, directly opposite the front door so that it is the first thing anyone sees when they walk into my home. A family photograph, taken at Lily's school picnic 8 weeks earlier. I remember the day clearly. Sunny, slightly windy, everyone a little squinting at the camera. I had worn the cream-colored blouse with a small embroidered collar. I had stood with one hand on Marcus's shoulder and my arm around Lily. There had been a moment when Lily pressed her face against my arm and the photographer, another parent with a good camera, had captured it. I had seen the image on Marcus's phone that same evening and thought it was one of the nicest photographs of our family in years. In the version now hanging on my wall, I did not exist. The image had been cropped and digitally extended so that where I had stood was now only a continuation of the garden behind us. Marcus stood on one side. Lily stood in the center, where she had always been. And then, to Lily's left, there was nothing. A smear of green. A lie printed on photo paper and framed in my own mahogany. I stood in front of it for what felt like a long time, but was probably less than 2 minutes. I heard the car in the driveway. I heard the front door open. I heard Lily's shoes on the entryway floor, and I heard Renata behind her, and I did not move. "Oh, you saw it," Renata said. She did not say it with shame. She said it with the slight, brisk energy of someone who expects an approval they haven't bothered to formally request. I turned and looked at her. "I'm looking at it," I said. "What happened to the original photograph?" She set her bag down on the console table, on my console table next to the frame she had put on my wall, and said, "I liked this composition better. It was a little crowded before." "I was in it," I said. She glanced at the photograph, then back at me, and she shrugged in that way she has, a small, efficient movement that says, "I have considered your concern and found it beneath the level of effort required to address it." And she said, "Nobody will notice, Eleanor. Don't be so sensitive." Marcus was somewhere behind her. I did not look at him. I looked at Renata, and I held her gaze. And I said nothing for a moment that went on slightly longer than comfortable. Then I said, "I notice." And I went upstairs. There are certain moments in a life when everything you have been slowly understanding suddenly becomes very clear. The way a fog burns off, not gradually, but all at once. And you find yourself standing in a landscape you have actually been in for years, but are only now seeing in full. This was one of those moments. I sat at the edge of my bed, in my room, in my house, and I was not crying. I was thinking. What Renata had done was not in isolation a catastrophic act. It was a petty one. But pettiness, in the right context, is revelatory. A person who erases you from a family photograph and hangs it on your wall and tells you not to be sensitive is not making a mistake. They are telling you exactly what they think of you. They are telling you that your presence is conditional, visible when useful, removable when inconvenient. And they are telling you that they expect you to absorb this, as you have absorbed everything else, quietly and without consequence. I want to say something here to anyone who might need to hear it, because I have come to believe that this kind of behavior has a name, and it is important to name it. What Renata had been practicing in our relationship for years is something behavioral therapists call entitlement projection. The unconscious, or sometimes quite conscious, assumption that another person's resources, time, attention, and space exist as an extension of one's own needs and preferences. It is different from ordinary selfishness because the person does not think of themselves as taking. They genuinely believe they are simply arranging what is naturally available to them. And the insidious part of this dynamic is that it is designed to make the other person feel unreasonable for objecting. If a resource has been freely available for long enough, any restriction begins to feel, to the person who has been benefiting, like an act of aggression. They are not losing something you gave them. They are losing something they had come to believe was theirs. I had been teaching Renata, without meaning to, that my house was a resource without conditions, that my kitchen was communal, that my savings were a safety net she could factor into her planning, that my presence in a family photograph could be weighed against her aesthetic preferences and found, on balance, unnecessary. And the law, not in a technical, litigious sense, but in the simple, foundational sense of what any adult is entitled to in their own home, does not require me to sustain that lesson. A homeowner's right to determine who enters their space, under what conditions, and for how long, is not subject to the preferences of the person being hosted. It is not modified by family sentiment. It is not suspended by past generosity. I owned this house. I had paid for it across 22 years of my working life. And whatever Renata had come to believe about it, the house had not changed owners. I came downstairs the following morning, having slept, unexpectedly, very well. I made my tea at my kettle, which I moved back to its original position without comment. I sat at the kitchen table and ate my breakfast. When Renata came down and opened my refrigerator and began removing items for her breakfast, I watched her do it without saying anything because I had already decided that what I needed to say would be said through action rather than argument. I've noticed over the years that people who are accustomed to winning verbal exchanges through confidence and volume tend to be genuinely unprepared for a person who simply stops participating in the dynamic and begins making different arrangements. That afternoon, I drove to a shop in town that sells housewares and organization items. I bought a compact refrigerator of the under-counter variety, efficient and quiet, with a small lock on the handle. I also bought a combination lock for the door of my study, the keyed type that replaces the original handle. And I bought a deadbolt, the kind a person can install with a standard drill in about 20 minutes, for the door of my craft room. I carried everything in through the back door while Renata was on the phone in the living room, and Lily was watching something upstairs. Marcus was in the yard. I set the compact refrigerator up in my bedroom, in the corner near the closet, plugged it in, and began moving items from the main kitchen refrigerator, my items, into it. My good cheeses, the smoked salmon I had bought for myself, the specific yogurt I have every morning, the elderflower cordial I keep for evenings, the leftover portion of a casserole I had made 2 days before and that had been depleted by half since their arrival in a way I had not authorized. I left the kitchen refrigerator stocked with basics: eggs, basic dairy, condiments, bread, fruit, items that a guest in my home could reasonably expect to find available. Then I went to my study and changed the handle to the locked one. And I went to my craft room and installed the deadbolt. Neither Marcus nor Renata was particularly observant that evening, which suited me well. Lily and I baked cookies after dinner, which was the most enjoyable hour I'd spent in the house since their arrival. Lily has a very focused approach to measuring flour, which I find touching. She levels the cup with one small finger, very seriously, and then checks it from eye level to be certain. Renata noticed the refrigerator the next morning when she came to find the smoked salmon. She stood in the doorway of my bedroom, which she had entered without knocking, and looked at the small appliance in the corner of my room with an expression I can only describe as calibrating. I was sitting in the chair by my window with my book. I did not look up. "Is that a mini fridge?" she said. "It is," I said. A pause. "For your room?" "Yes." Another pause, longer. "Where's the salmon?" "In my refrigerator," I said. I turned a page. She left without further comment, which told me she was not yet ready to escalate but was deciding whether to. I had time. I turned another page. She found the locked study door that afternoon and the locked craft room door the following morning. The craft room discovery produced a different response. She tried the handle twice, then knocked, though I was not inside. When I came into the hallway from the staircase, she turned to me and said, with the careful neutrality of someone exercising restraint, "Why is this room locked?" "I'd like to keep that space for my own use while the house is occupied," I said. "We're not going to go through your craft things, Eleanor." "I know," I said. "I'd like to keep it locked regardless." She studied me for a moment with that measuring expression. "Is this about the photograph?" she said. "The photograph is on the wall where I didn't put it," I said. "We can talk about that when you'd like to. For now, I'd prefer the room stays locked." I went back downstairs. I heard her on the phone with Marcus approximately 15 minutes later, which I expected. Marcus came home that evening with the particular expression he wears when he has been working himself up to a conversation he does not want to have. He waited until Lily was in bed. Then he sat across from me at the kitchen table where I was finishing my crossword, and he said, "Mom, I think we need to talk about what's going on." I set down my pen. I gave him my full attention, which I have found over the years tends to make people slightly less comfortable than they expected because it removes the possibility of being misunderstood or only partially heard. I said, "I'm listening." He said that Renata felt I was being cold. He said the locked doors felt like a punishment. He said the photograph, and here he paused and looked at the table. He said, maybe Renata could have handled that better, but it wasn't worth making everyone uncomfortable over. He said it in the way he says things when he has internalized someone else's framing and is presenting it as his own conclusion. I have watched him do this since he was a teenager, and it has always made me sad because Marcus is actually a perceptive person when he is not being quietly managed. I said, "Marcus, Who decided that you and Renata would stay here? He looked up. Well, you agreed. I agreed when you said it would be 2 to 3 weeks. When did 3 weeks become open-ended? He paused. The contractor had a delay. When were you going to tell me about the delay? Another pause. We just found out. You found out last Friday, I said. I know because I overheard your call with the contractor. So the question is why you decided not to tell me, and I think we both understand the answer to that. He did not respond immediately. I let the silence sit. The photograph, Marcus, I said. Your wife edited me out of a family photograph, printed it, framed it, and hung it on my wall, in my house, using my frame. And when I saw it and asked about it, she told me nobody would notice, and that I was being sensitive. I kept my voice level. I need you to think carefully about whether what I am doing, locking a few rooms, keeping my own food separate, represents an unreasonable response to that sequence of events. Marcus rubbed the side of his face. He said quietly, she shouldn't have done that. No, I said, she shouldn't have. I'll talk to her. I appreciate that, I said. But Marcus, this is not really about the photograph. The photograph is simply the clearest thing. This is about a pattern that has been going on for years, and I want you to understand that I am not interested in continuing it. He looked at me with an expression that I recognized. The expression of a person who loves someone and is also frightened of the implications of what that person is saying. I understood it. I did not soften my position. This house, and I said, is the only thing in my life that is entirely mine. I paid for it with your father, and then I kept paying for it after he was gone, and I have maintained it and tended it for 22 years. It is not a guest house. It is not a family facility. It is my home. And how I choose to manage it, and who I choose to allow inside it, and under what conditions are decisions that belong to me and no one else. I am not angry. I am not punishing anyone. I am simply deciding to live in my house the way a person who owns their house is entitled to live in it. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, What do you want? I want you to talk to Renata, I said. I want the original photograph returned to me or replaced. And I would like a conversation about the actual timeline for your stay, because I need to know how long I am planning for. He nodded. I picked up my crossword pen. He sat there for another few seconds, then got up and went upstairs. The photograph came down from the wall the following morning. I did not see who removed it. It was simply no longer there when I came downstairs. No one mentioned it. I had expected no one to mention it. I took the mahogany frame from the console table where it had been left and carried it back to my supply shelf. And I set it there, and that was that. But I had been watching something else in the meantime. I had been watching my bank statements. Let me be precise about this. I am not a person who tracks every transaction obsessively. I am organized and I review my accounts monthly, which I do on the 15th of each month as a habit I built when Gerald and I were first managing the household together. The 15th fell on a Thursday, about 2 weeks into Marcus and Renata's stay. I sat at my desk with my reading glasses and my laptop, and I went through the previous month's transactions as I always do. There was a charge I did not recognize. It was from a grocery delivery service, and it was for $212. I did not use this service. I did not remember authorizing this charge. I went further back to the previous month and found another. $178 from a different grocery platform. I looked more carefully. I found a charge to a streaming service I had canceled 18 months ago. $7.99 a month for the past 7 months, which I had simply missed in my reviews, and which I now recognized as a platform Renata used regularly. I found a charge to a housewares subscription box, which I had never heard of, for $42. The total across 4 months, looking backward, was $473. This was not a vast sum, but it was my sum, and no one had asked me about it. The most likely explanation was the card I kept in the kitchen drawer, an older credit card I used for household purchases and rarely thought about. I had, at some point during a previous visit, let Renata use it to order something when I was occupied, and I had apparently not been specific enough about the fact that this was a one-time permission. I took the card from the kitchen drawer. I sat with it in my hand for a moment. Then I went upstairs to my room, closed the door, called the credit card company, and reported it lost. A replacement card would arrive in 5 to 7 business days with a new number. The old card would be deactivated within the hour. I was very calm during the phone call. The representative on the line was pleasant. I thanked her and ended the call. That evening, I also changed the password on the household Wi-Fi. I had been meaning to update it for months. It was an old, easy password that I had never thought to change. I generated a new one, 16 characters, and reset the router. When Renata's phone disconnected and she came downstairs to ask about the internet, I said I had updated the security password and would she like me to put her devices on the new network. She said yes. I connected Lily's tablet and Marcus's phone because I was not interested in inconveniencing either of them. I told Renata she was welcome to connect her devices if she handed them to me. I would put them on the new network directly. She did not hand me her devices. She said she'd figure it out later. She didn't, as far as I could tell, because the following morning, she asked Marcus to fix it. And Marcus spent 20 minutes on it before coming to ask me for the password. I gave it to him. I want to be clear that I was not making these decisions out of spite. Spite is exhausting and ultimately pointless. I was making these decisions because I'd identified a situation in which my resources were being accessed without my explicit, ongoing, considered consent. And I was restoring the natural order of things, which is that my resources belong to me and accessing them requires my agreement. The car presented itself as an issue on a Saturday morning, 10 days into their stay. My car is a 5-year-old sedan, well-maintained, insured under my name, registered in my name. I keep a spare key on a hook inside the kitchen cabinet near the door where I have always kept it, out of habit. I came down that Saturday, intending to drive to the farmer's market, which I do every Saturday during the summer. My car was not in the driveway. I stood in the empty driveway for a moment, looking at the rectangle of bare concrete where my car had been. I went back inside and looked at the hook. The spare key was gone. I went upstairs and knocked on the guest room door. Marcus answered, in his robe, somewhat bleary. "Where is my car?" I said. He blinked. "Renata took it. She had an early appointment for, I think, Lily's thing." "She took my car," I said, without asking me. He looked genuinely uncertain. I thought, "She said she always borrows it when she needs—" "She has used it once before," I said, when I specifically offered. I did not offer it this morning. The blankness on his face, the sincere, undefended blankness of someone who is realizing in real time that a thing they accepted as normal is not in fact normal, was one of the more affecting things I had seen in the course of this whole situation. He said very quietly, "I'm sorry, Mom. I didn't think about that." "I know you didn't," I said. "I need you to call her and let her know she needs to bring it back. And I need the spare key returned to me. And in the future, I would appreciate it if you would both understand that the car requires a conversation before it leaves the driveway." Renata brought the car back an hour later. She came in through the kitchen without speaking to me directly, put the spare key on the counter rather than on the hook, and went upstairs. I picked the key up and put it in my bedroom, in the drawer of my nightstand. I removed the car from the discussion entirely 2 days later by changing where I stored both keys, primary and spare, to a location that was my own business. I also called my insurance agent and had a brief conversation about the policy terms regarding unauthorized use of the vehicle. The agent was helpful. I made a note of what he told me. 11 days after Marcus and Renata arrived, I received a phone call from a number I recognized as my sister-in-law, Pauline. Pauline is Gerald's younger sister, and she and I have maintained a cordial, if intermittent, relationship since his death. She lives about 40 minutes away, and we see each other at Christmas and occasionally in between. I answered the phone with genuine warmth because I have no fundamental quarrel with Pauline. She said she had heard I had the young ones staying with me, and she said she hoped everything was going well. I said the situation was being managed. She said she had been thinking about coming to visit if I had room. She had some things she wanted to discuss. I said I had room in the sense that I had a couch, since the guest room was currently occupied, but that she was welcome. Pauline arrived the following afternoon. She is 61, 2 years younger than I am, and she has her brother's dark eyes and a version of his dry humor that I've always liked. We had tea. She was good company for about an hour, and then the conversation turned to Gerald's estate, which I had thought was fully resolved 3 years ago. It was not that there was any legal ambiguity. The estate had been properly settled. What Pauline had come to discuss was what she called the question of what makes sense going forward, a phrase she repeated several times, each time in a slightly different context. She said she had been thinking about whether it really made sense for me to maintain such a large house alone, now that I was in my 60s and Gerald was gone, and the maintenance was surely a burden. She said she supposed I had thought about what I intended to do with the house eventually. She said her current rental situation was really not sustainable, and she had always loved this house since she and Gerald were children. She did not ask for the house directly. What she asked for by the end of the second cup of tea was a loan of $30,000 to put toward a down payment on a condo she had been looking at. She mentioned, without elaborating, that she assumed I was fairly comfortable and that Gerald would have wanted the family to support each other. I listened to all of this with the same attention I had given to Marcus, which is to say, complete and unhurried attention. When she finished, I set down my cup and said, "Pauline, I am glad you felt comfortable enough to talk to me directly. I want to be equally direct with you. I am not in a position to lend the money, and I want to be honest with you about why. I do not lend large sums to family because, in my experience, such loans change relationships in ways that are not worth the amount of the loan. What I save is for my own care and my own future. That is not going to change." She looked at me with an expression that cycled through several states before settling on something that resembled wounded dignity. She said, Gerald would never have... Gerald and I made our financial decisions together, I said, and we agreed on this one. I am the continuation of those decisions. She left within the hour. The visit had lasted less than 3. I watched her car pull out of my driveway, and then I went inside and made myself another cup of tea and felt no guilt about the conversation at all, which itself felt like a kind of progress. There had been a time in my life when a conversation like that would have kept me awake for 3 nights. Now it was simply something I had said clearly, and it was done. The week that followed brought a new development in the form of the 4th bedroom, the one I use as a craft space. I had locked it, as I mentioned. On a Thursday morning, I came home from a walk and found the lock had been tampered with. Not broken exactly, but the mechanism had been manipulated, and the door was open. Renata was inside. She had moved the storage boxes I keep stacked along one wall and arranged several of her own items on the work table I use for quilting. Her makeup case, a small Bluetooth speaker, a folded pile of clothes she had apparently decided to use the table as additional wardrobe space for. She was standing at the far side of the room, looking at the window, when I appeared in the doorway. She turned and said, without particular guilt, "This room gets the best morning light. I've been using it for my skincare routine. You never use it this early anyway." I looked at the table. I looked at my boxes, repositioned without care or ceremony, some of them slightly crumpled at the corners. I looked at the work table where I had been in the middle of a quilt I was making for Lily, the squares still laid out, some of them now disturbed by the presence of Renata's makeup bag. "How did you open the door?" I said. She made a vague gesture. "The lock wasn't that. I have a bobby pin." I walked into the room. I picked up her makeup case and I set it in the hallway. I picked up the Bluetooth speaker and I set it in the hallway. I picked up the stack of clothes and I set it in the hallway. I straightened the quilt squares with care. I repositioned the storage boxes. Then I walked back to the door and turned to face her. "This room," I said, "is not available." She stared at me with an expression I had not seen on her face before, because it was an expression produced by something she had not previously experienced in my company, which was the specific, unambiguous reality of an action completed and a boundary held without negotiation or apology. It was the expression of a person who has found for the first time that the floor does not extend in this particular direction. She said, "You are being absolutely... I'm going to change this lock to a keyed deadbolt today," I said, "and I will not be sharing the key. If you need a space with good light, the dining room window faces east and is available in the mornings." I left her there. I heard her behind me saying something under her breath, and then I heard her pick up her things from the hallway, and then I heard the guest room door close with considerably more force than necessary. I wrote down the time and date on the notepad I keep in my desk drawer. Not because I expected to need a record, but because I had learned that the act of writing things down tends to clarify one's own thinking and also tends to be useful in ways one does not always anticipate. That evening, Marcus was quieter than he had been during the stay. He sat at the dinner table and ate without much conversation, glancing between Renata and me with the expression of a man who is trying to determine which of two forces is likely to move less. Renata ate with the precise posture of someone performing a dignity they do not entirely feel. After dinner, when Lily had gone up to brush her teeth, Renata put her fork down and said, not at me, but with the studied indirection of someone addressing the center of the table, "I cannot live like this." Marcus said carefully, "What do you mean?" "She has locked every room," Renata said, meaning me without looking at me. "She has taken all the food into her room. She is treating us like intruders." "You broke a lock I put on my own door," I said pleasantly. "And you rearranged items on a table where I have a project in progress." "I barely touched—" "You moved my quilt squares." There was a silence. Marcus said, "Renata, don't," she said sharply. The sharpness was not directed at me, it was directed at him. And in that redirection, I observed something interesting. The beginning of a fracture. Because Renata's anger, in this moment, had two available targets. Me, whom it could not move, and Marcus, who was seated within reach and had, from her perspective, been insufficiently useful in correcting the situation. The frustration of finding one front impassable tends to concentrate itself on the front that offers more purchase. "You said you'd handle it," she said to him. "I talked to her," he said, "and nothing changed. She has a—" He paused and started over. "Renata, she has a point about the lock." The look she gave him then was the look of someone recognizing, with precision and without warmth, that they are temporarily alone. She pushed back her chair, carried her plate to the sink, and left the kitchen. I heard her footsteps on the stairs and then the sound of the guest room door again. Not quite as forceful as before, but not gentle either. Marcus and I sat at the table in the kitchen with the quiet between us, which was, for the first time in weeks, not uncomfortable. "She told me the contractor delay is another 6 weeks," he said eventually. "6 weeks from when?" I said. "From now." I looked at him steadily. "I know," he said. "What do you want to do, Marcus?" He was quiet for a while. I could see him turning things over. He said finally, "I don't think we can stay here for 6 more weeks." "I think that is a reasonable conclusion," I said. "I'll start looking for a short-term rental tomorrow." I nodded. I said, "I want to be clear that I am saying this without anger and without wanting to hurt you. But I also want to be clear that the choice to leave needs to be made and followed through this time. I cannot continue to have my home managed as a resource for someone else's convenience." He nodded slowly. He said, "I know, Mom. I know." We sat there a bit longer. I made him a cup of tea he didn't ask for, and he drank it without either of us saying very much. It was the most honest hour we had spent together in years, and I do not think I am wrong to feel grateful for it. The following morning, Renata came downstairs with a different quality of energy. Not softened exactly. Renata does not do softened as a primary register, but recalibrated. She sat at the kitchen table and said she wanted to talk. I sat across from her with my own tea and I listened. What she said, in essence, was that she felt I had never liked her, that the locked doors and the refrigerator and the reaction to the craft room were all expressions of a hostility I had been harboring for years and had now decided to express through household management. She said she had always tried with me. She said she had always made an effort. She said she was sorry if the photograph was insensitive. She used the word if, but she hadn't thought it was a big deal, and she couldn't understand why I was making it into one. I listened to all of it. I waited until she had finished. Then I said, "Renata, I don't harbor hostility toward you. I want to be honest about that because it matters. What I do have, and what I have had for some time, is a clear recognition that our relationship has developed a pattern in which my generosity is treated as a default rather than a choice. The photograph was not the cause of what I'm doing now. It was simply the moment when I decided I was done deferring to a dynamic that doesn't serve me. I accept your apology." I want to be clear, though, that accepting your apology doesn't mean returning to how things were before, because how things were before isn't something I am willing to return to. She looked at me for a long moment. Something in her expression shifted in a way that was difficult to read. I think, and I may be wrong because I'm not always precise about Renata's interior life, that she had not anticipated this particular response. She had anticipated either a fight or a capitulation. She was not prepared for a simple, contained acceptance that changed nothing. She said, "So what does that mean? For us? For the family?" "It means we have a chance to start from a different place," I said. "But the starting point has to be honest. My house is my house. My savings are my savings. My time and my car and my space belong to me. And any role I play in this family, as mother, grandmother, host, is a role I choose, not a function I perform." She looked at the table. She didn't respond for a moment. Then she said, "Fine." And she got up and poured herself coffee, and that was the end of our conversation. Marcus found a short-term furnished apartment the following Monday. It was available at the end of that week. He told me at dinner with a directness that I thought was genuinely brave of him. And Lily cried briefly because she had liked being at my house, and I held her and told her she could come and see me any Saturday she wanted. Just her, and we would bake something and work in the garden. And her crying stopped with the speed peculiar to 7-year-olds, replaced immediately by a detailed description of what she thought we should bake. The packing happened over 2 days. Renata was efficient and silent during it. She moved through the house, collecting things with a focus that I recognized as a coping mechanism. She is someone who manages uncomfortable feelings through productivity. I gave her space to do it. On the last evening, she found me in the garden as the light was going orange, and she stood at the edge of the beds for a moment, not quite looking at me, and said, "You really never liked that photograph, did you?" I looked up at her. I said, "I was in the original one. I had a hand on Marcus's shoulder. Lily was leaning against my arm." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, in a voice that was smaller than her usual register, "I know." She went back inside. I stayed in the garden a while longer, turning the soil at the base of the lavender, and the air smelled the way it does in late summer in the evening, like earth and grass and something beginning to turn toward autumn, and I felt very quietly exactly where I was. The morning they left, Marcus hugged me at the door in the way he has been hugging me since he was a teenager. Both arms, his chin on the top of my head, slightly too tight, which I've always taken as his particular expression of wanting everything to be all right. I patted his back and told him to call me more often. Not with requests, just to call. He said he would. Lily kissed my cheek 3 times and informed me gravely that she was going to learn to level flour properly before her next visit. I told her that was an excellent plan. Renata stood at the car and gave me a nod, which I returned. The car pulled out of my driveway. I stood at the door and watched it go. Then I closed the door. I stood in the entryway of my own house, in the silence that I had nearly forgotten existed, and I looked at the wall above the console table where the photograph had hung, and the wall was just a wall, bare and neutral, and entirely mine. I went to the kitchen and made tea with the unhurried deliberateness that I have come to think of as my personal ceremony of reclamation. Proper loose leaf. In the blue pot Gerald bought at a market in Vermont 20 years ago, left to steep for the full 4 minutes that it deserves. I took the cup to the back porch. I sat in the chair that faces the garden. The apple trees were doing the thing they do in August, dropping their fruit onto the lawn with the quiet, indifferent abundance of things that simply do what they are built to do, whether anyone is watching or not. I sat there for a long time. I did not feel triumphant. I'm not sure triumph is the right emotion for the end of this particular kind of story. What I felt was level, even, like a house that has had its foundation carefully checked and found to be sound. In the weeks after, Marcus called twice just to call, the way I'd asked. The second call, he mentioned that he and Renata were in couples counseling. He said it with a careful neutrality that told me he was not sure how I would receive the information. I told him I thought that was a good thing, and I meant it. Not because their difficulties were mine to manage, but because Marcus is a perceptive person who, when not operating under the quiet guidance of someone else's preferences, tends to find his way. I believe Lily is best served by two parents who understand each other clearly. And I believe Marcus is best served by becoming the kind of person who does not manage conflict by stacking sandbags. 3 months later, on a Saturday morning in October, Marcus called and asked, not told. Not assumed, but asked with a pause in which he was clearly waiting for an actual answer, whether Lily could come spend the day with me. I said yes with a warmth that I do not think required any performance. Lily arrived at 10 o'clock with her hair in two lopsided braids she had done herself, carrying a picture she had drawn of my garden. She had included the apple trees and had rendered the lavender in purple crayon, with what I can only describe as interpretive ambition. We made scones. We leveled the flower together, very seriously. We walked to the back of the garden and I showed her where the second planting of lavender had just pushed through. She held a stalk in her small hand and smelled it with her eyes closed, which is the most concentrated expression of pure experience I know, and I thought, this is what I was protecting. Not just a house, not just a savings account. This. The right to give my presence and my time as a gift rather than a guarantee. What I have learned over the course of this story and the years of smaller stories that led to it is something that sounds simple, but that I had to walk a long road to actually understand in my body, in my daily life. The ability to receive love freely depends on first establishing that it is freely given. When you allow someone to treat your love as a right, you do not become more loved. You become invisible. You become the background of the family photograph rather than the person in it. The boundary is not a wall that keeps people out. It is the thing that makes it possible for the people worth keeping to find their way to you and stay there on honest terms. If someone asked me now what I would say to the woman I was before any of this, the one who gave her crystal glasses and 3 months of mortgage payments and 4 layers of birthday cake without ever once asking whether she was being treated as a person rather than a convenience, I think I would say you are allowed to occupy the frame. You are allowed to be visible. No one gets to edit you out of your own life and call you sensitive for noticing. There is a version of the family that exists now that is quieter and cleaner than the one that existed before. It does not have the false warmth of a relationship held together by obligation and overlooked resentment. What it has instead is something more durable. An understanding still being built of what each person in it actually owes the others and what each person in it has genuinely chosen to give. That distinction between the chosen and the assumed is everything. It is the whole lesson if I had to distill it to a line. Your piece is not a guest room. It is not available for loan. It is not a common space that anyone with a bold enough assumption can walk into and rearrange. It is the most essential thing you have built, and you are the only person qualified to decide who is welcome inside it. I think about this community often, about the people who find their way to these stories, not because they enjoy other people's difficulties, but because they recognize something in them, a pattern they are living or have lived or are afraid might be coming. If you recognize something in what I have shared today, if you have ever found yourself edited out of your own life and told not to be sensitive about it, I want you to know that what you are feeling is not disproportionate. It is information. It is your sense of yourself telling you something important, and it is worth listening to. Leave me a comment if this story meant something to you. Tell me your own version of it, or simply tell me that you heard it. And if you are not yet part of this channel, I hope you will stay. Not because I'm asking you to, but because I think there is something useful in the company of people who are choosing, at whatever age and in whatever circumstances, to take themselves seriously. That is what we are doing here. It is quiet work, but it is the most important kind.